Good afternoon and welcome to this book launch. I'm going to read for about 15 to 20 minutes and discuss the significance of the Battle of Chibi, which is what I have chosen as a title for this book, which is not only a translation from the Romance of Three Kingdoms, but also a selection, because the Romance of the Three Kingdoms was written at a time when people didn't mind what they call a shaggy dog tale that goes on and on and on and on. And by the time you get to the middle of it, most of the people you started, the characters that you started off are already dead. And then, but the story continues and for another 50 years, which is the case with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I decided to give it a focus, which is the Battle of Chibi, which is a very significant battle. I thought at first it was just another battle, but it wasn't just another battle. And secondly, I'd like to discuss one particular major conflict of ideas. There are many that are discussed in both the original and in my book. And this conflict of ideas is that between fate and honor. We'll say more when the time appears. And thirdly, there is at the end of my book, but it occurs in the middle of the Romance of Three Kingdoms, what I consider to be a wonderful eulogy pronounced by someone who considered the person who had recently departed to be a worthy antagonist. They had fought on the same side, and then they fought on opposite sides, and it was his eulogy to this worthy antagonist. It reminds me in a way of the end of the Iliad, which is the funeral games, not for Achilles, not for Patroclus, but for Hector, who is the opponent to, who was the champion of the Trojans against the Greek forces. There was no funeral eulogy, but the games themselves constituted, I believe, the kind of the end, and it, I hope, creates an echo or sort of a literary reminder of the epic, the Greek epic, and perhaps people might think of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms as an epic. Let me just start. After I'm done, I will entertain questions and try to give answers to anything about the book or about my writing of it. Long ago, along a stretch of a river deep and wide, but far away from the consciousness or imagination of anyone outside all under heaven, China, a battle was fought that determined the fate of its people for the next 400 years. Now, it is widely believed that China had the longest continuous imperial history of any civilization. This may or may not be true, but it is often implied that it began around 220-ish BC, when China was unified under a Napoleonic figure who not only unified the realm but also gave it unified measures, weights and measures, which does a great deal to standardize commerce, gave it unified roads, and not he himself, but some of his successors during the Han Dynasty unified the writing of the Chinese character. And this was made public on many stone carvings, some of which still exist, in which the emperor's Chinese, so to speak, was made available throughout the empire. This is how Chinese is going to be written, guys. Do it. And in many ways, China has maintained its cultural unity because it has maintained a linguistic or a literary written unity. China had this thing about imperial unity, and so when the Battle of Chibi was fought, it was extremely significant. It was the end of more than 400 years of imperial unity. And I tried to think what is comparable to this. And I have not been able to think of it for very long, but recently there have been the start of many things about the Civil War. And I thought, well, what if the battle for Atlanta had been lost? What if Sherman was defeated? I don't think the cause for Union would have been lost, but I'm pretty sure that Lincoln would not have been elected, and therefore the attempt to defeat the South would have been given up, and there may have been a division of the United States into many parts. This is what the Battle of Chibi achieved. It caused the momentum for one of its principal leaders, Cao Cao, and we'll come back to him, to be stopped. After the battle, he did not die in the battle. He was merely defeated. But he never again undertook to pacify south of the Yangtze River. He retreated to the heartlands of China in the north. So this is the significance of the Battle of Chibi. It wasn't only a great battle in which lots of glorious, heroic deeds were done. It resulted in a period that has been variously called the period of the Five Dynasties and the 10 Kingdoms, or the period of the 6 dynasties, and then depending on which book you read, which were the 6 dynasties. So all of which confusion reflects this period, which is probably best known as the Age of Fragmentation. From an imperial unity to which China returned, because at the end of this 400 years of wandering, the Jewish people wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before they reached the Promised Land. The Chinese Empire wandered around for 400 years before they were reunited by the great efforts of the Sui and the Tang dynasty. And they remained an empire, although there were changes in the dynasties and various peoples took over, some not Chinese. The Yuan, the Mongols, ruled China for a while. The Qing were the Manchus, and they ruled China until China became a republic. But that was the significance of this battle. What happened as a result was a fantastic flowering of culture and literature. Now, the Germans have a saying for this. And usually at this point, some of them might quote Hegel, who had a saying that the owl of Athena flies at midnight. To wit, when it looks bleakest politically, it could be the beginnings of cultural development. The owl of Athena being symbolic of intellectual, literary, cultural pursuits. Be that as it may. The Tang Dynasty, which we associate with the consolidation of the imperial unity of China, did all kinds of outreach It was during the Tang Dynasty that the Silk Road flourished. And it not only flourished over land, but also across the seas. They did not undertake a great deal of maritime activities, but they welcomed it. And so they established quarters for Arabs and Persians and Indians in various ports, principally the port of Canton, which developed during the Tang Dynasty. Back to the Battle of Chibi. It gave rise, during this flourishing of literature and creativity and poetry, to a lot of songs that became literary documents, because it wasn't just the street entertainers that talked about them, but it entered into the conversations of the educated class, and they would write poems, and these poems are, some of them, incorporated into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Some of the skits are incorporated into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I have tried to make my translation more reflective of the dialogue style that was in the original, which has not always been translated as dialogue by a couple of translations that I found. I found only 2 English translations. I'm told that there is a great Russian translation, but I don't read Russian, so. Compared with this sort of kind of lack of translation, there is this Journey to the West, which is another great Chinese classic. It is full of what I would call paranormal stuff, and therefore it is very exciting and very attractive to many readers. So the Journey to the West is much translated, and you can find it in various forms, and it's still being translated, and so on and so forth. But the Battle of Chibi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, remain a staple of Chinese, East Asian, Japanese, Korean cultures, and through manga, comic books, video games, it has entered into popular culture. And although the current Chinese literary establishment does not particularly encourage the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or the study of the Three Kingdoms, the TV stations or networks in China, every 15 years or so, come up with a new series. And their series are quite epic. They have 87, 120 episodes to retell the stories of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Anyway, the characters of the Three Kingdoms begin with Cao Cao. His name is a little bit difficult to pronounce because it's written C-A-O, C-A-O in the modern pinyin. And the C is always pronounced as if it's T-S, Cao Cao. And Cao Cao, T-S, is how it appears in many older translations of this name. He was the man who would be emperor. He was described as a teenager, as full of mischief, often making life miserable for his uncle, who complained about it to his father, who was, a strict father, filial piety and all that. You have to pay respect to your uncle. And until one day, Cao Cao threw an epileptic fit in the presence of his uncle. And his uncle dashed off to get his father. And when they arrived back at the scene, Cao Cao seemed to be quite normal. And he said, well, you know, Dad, my uncle kind of doesn't like me, and he's always trying to get me into trouble. That's why, you know, he's been complaining. So after that, his dad didn't pay any heed to what the uncle had to say. Cao Cao was that kind of guy. He was also ambitious. And because he was ambitious, he consulted fortune tellers. One of them told him that the Han Empire was in chaos and that a new empire builder would arise. It could be Wu. A second said upon meeting Cao, the Han is passing away together with the peace of all under heaven. Surely this is the man to rescue us. There was another fortune teller who was extremely reluctant to tell Cao Cao's fortune. Cao Cao persisted, and at last he said, in a peaceful generation, you would be a holder of high office. But in troubled times, you would be an ambitious scoundrel. And it is said that Cao Cao was particularly pleased to have that fortune told about him. He was a true, real historical figure. People write about him. In fact, in the 1990s or 80s, two academics, Chinese academics, separately wrote a couple of articles in January of that year, revisiting the issue of Cao Cao's character. Was he really the bad guy? Within 6 months, there were about 150 articles written by academics. In response, some of them saying, no, you're right, he's not such a bad guy. Some of them say, yes, he was such a bad guy. Showing great interest in this man. The Chinese now have a saying. It's been in the vocabulary for God knows how many centuries. If you talk about Cao Cao, he will show up. It's not like, you know, he who must not be named. It's more like, speak of the devil, and the devil will show up. But anyway, there's been a recent academic magnum opus. I have not read it. It's called Imperial Warlord. I think it's on Amazon.com, and it costs something like $80. So I'm going to wait until the libraries get it, and then I'll read it. He is known to have decided against including moral criteria in the selection of public servants. This was a very anti-Confucian thing, you know. I mean, a man had to be upright, he had to be filial, he had to be this, that, and the other thing. Cao Cao said, no. All I'm interested in knowing is whether this guy can do the job. I don't really care about anything else. He had that kind of reputation. And he started out during a rebellion, like most of the other main characters in the Three Kingdoms. Paid his dues during a rebellion against the Han Empire, helped to subdue various rebels. They were called Huang Jin, which is yellow pieces of cloth. It's been translated yellow handkerchiefs, yellow headbands, yellow scarves, yellow turbans. I leave it untranslated as Huang Jin, because if you say yellow turbans, then you have to go on to explain what you mean by yellow turbans. So why not just skip having to explain yellow turbans and go ahead and explain what Huang Jin means. Pieces of cloth that happen to be yellow that they tied around their heads to keep the hair out of their eyes when they went to battle. So you can think of it any way you like. Anyway, Cao Cao, having consolidated his power in the north, decided to go south. And as he moved southwards, he amassed a huge army. It is said that probably he had 1 million people. He claimed he had 1 million men under arms. in the Navy and in the armed forces, I mean on the land forces, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is that his forces maybe were 2 or 3 times the size of the defenders. And one of the stories or morals of the Battle of Chibi is that a small 40,000 man force, highly motivated, well-trained, well-generaled, can defeat a much bigger force, maybe 200, maybe 300,000. Whether they were actually 1 million or 1.5 million men, doesn't matter. The Chinese like to use round numbers, and they will say tens or hundreds or thousands or 10,000s, meaning a lot of people. So that was Cao Cao. Liu Bei, who is another major character, also won his stripes, so to speak, during the battles against the Huang Jin. He was a little younger than Cao Cao, and although while Cao Cao served in the imperial army, he was a volunteer, but he raised a local militia. He read a proclamation in which the imperial superintendent of the county said, we need able-bodied men to volunteer to be vigilantes or deputized in posses to go after the rebels. And as he read, he sighed, and a stern voice behind him said, "A true patriot should not hesitate to defend his house and country. Why do you sigh?" The speaker was Zhang Fei, who was from a successful peasant family. In addition to farming, they had a vineyard, and they brought up pigs, and they sold pork, and so they were successful farming. But the interesting thing is that these guys were all literate. Yeah. Liu Bei could read the proclamation. Zhang Fei, although a butcher, from a family of butchers and sharecropper, was able to read also, because he too was there, and he could tell what the proclamation was about. They were joined by Guan Yu, and Guan Yu was noted as being a scholar of certain of the Confucian classics. These 3 heroes took a famous vow to band together, and they made this vow in a peach orchard belonging to Fei. The peach tree, by the way, is supposed to have certain magical powers to protect against goblins, gremlins, and things that go boom in the night. It's much like the rose bush is supposed to protect secret whispers from eavesdroppers. Hence our term, sub rosa. Anyway, they went into this peach orchard and they swore. Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei, despite their different family names, solemnly swear to hold each other as brothers, to unite in heart and purpose, to help the oppressed, and to defend the homeland. And they actually formed what became historically known as one of the first successful brotherhoods. There were brotherhoods and there were brotherhoods. But these 3 became enshrined in the imaginations of the people. And so many centuries after this, brotherhoods, including secret societies that were semi-criminal in nature, looked up to the Peach Orchard Covenant as a kind of template for forming their own societies. And oaths of loyalty and personal honesty in their dealings with each other, not with the outside, those outside the society. In addition, Bei felt a need for a military strategist. And how are we doing for time?
Okay. Fine.
Okay. And he went to recruit a man who belonged to a kind of a men's club. They discussed important books and important ideas, and there were 4 or 5 of them, and we find evidence of several such groups. There was another character who appears briefly, although he's a very important character historically. His name's Liu Biao, and he was part of a group called the 8 Talents of a certain part of China. This was how guys got together and solved the problems of China, so to speak. They would discuss what was right, wrong, good, bad, so on and so forth. In his search for this Zhuge Liang, who also has a name called, it's called Master Wo Long, which has been translated Sleeping Dragon, and here I do allow myself to pass on the translation. It's just a lot easier than explaining this. Wo Long, Sleeping Dragon, Crouching Dragon, Hidden Dragon, whatever. They had these nicknames. Zhuge Liang had this nickname, and Zhuge Liang was difficult to find. Liu Bei went to 3 times to his house before he found him. And when he found him, he was so enamored of his ideas that he spent a lot of his time talking and listening and trying out various ideas, to the extent that his 2 other oath brothers said, you know, he's a very young guy, and we haven't seen anything of his work in action. Do you think it's wise to trust him so much? And they said, I have sought after him as fish seeks water. Don't want to hear any more about this. This gave rise to an episode which is somewhat humorous, where, you know, finally Cao Cao is hot on their heels, and Liu Bei says, what do we do? You know, he's now 2 days, 3 days march away. And Zhang Fei says to him, older brother, don't we have that fellow you call Water? Couldn't we ask him to come up with some ideas? This is sort of a humorous thing, but at any rate, the clash between, and the guy actually does come out with a couple of schemes that slows Cao Cao down. A couple of times, they win a couple of battles, but you know, the numbers were overwhelming, and although they won each battle, they knew that in the long run they were going to lose this war. But first, the clash of ideas. The clash between Bei and Cao was not only a military event, it was also the clash of ideas. Honor meets fate. Like many pre-modern societies, the Chinese believed in the divinity that guides our ends, the stars that reveal what fate has in store for man. The mandate of heaven, which is a Chinese concept which was made it into history books, itself could be withdrawn from a dynasty if the dynasty ruled poorly, and then the mandate could be passed on to the next dynasty that ruled well. So what is a man of honor to do? What if you've already sworn to uphold the dynasty that's now considered passé? This conflict is a theme that appears repeatedly in the romance and therefore in this book. When Bei was still trying to recruit Liang, he met one of the men's group, members of the men's group, Liang's men's group, to whom he explained that there is great disorder in the world these days, turmoil everywhere one turns. I want to meet Liang to ask him for a strategy to bring peace to the world. Liang's friend said, honored elder looks on disorder from the point of view of a ruler, and no doubt that of an honorable man. But from ancient times, order and disorder are both to be expected. After 400 years of unity under the Han Dynasty, peace is getting old, and there is reason for dried up spears to be wielded again. Order slips into chaos. This will not be easily reversed. To this Bei could only say, I am a servant of the Han Dynasty. I have sworn to uphold the Han Dynasty. And I cannot, my honor will not allow me to leave it to fate. This is very likely the prevailing view at the time that the romance of the Three Kingdoms was finally compiled, which was probably in the 15th century. That would be about 1200 years after the battle itself was fought. At the time of the Battle of Chibi, it was less clear that this is what a man of honor should do. And I personally think that it is very significant that the guy in the 15th century who crafted the final version of the romance of the Three Kingdoms, he sequenced the stories, and we know he put things not always in the sequence in which things happen. He sequenced them so that Zhuge Liang's debates in Wu took place just after Liu Bei's encounter with this man. And he had last spent, Zhuge Liang, the last vacation he had before he entered the service of Liu Bei was to go off wandering with this man who had told Lord Bei that, order and chaos succeed each other according to the heavens. I think the author or the compiler of the romance was not as persuaded as the Confucian orthodoxy was in the 15th century about how honor and faith should fall out. Nevertheless, Liang goes to recruit another warlord so that number 2 and number 3 should face number 1 together, and they would together defeat Sherman at the Battle of that time. He encountered some resistance. First of all, they say the Han Dynasty is over, one of the counselors told Liang. Heaven has passed judgment. Liang replied, you are a subject of the Han. If you see treachery anywhere, you must oppose it and punish the traitors. Cao and his ancestors had prospered through favors from the Han Dynasty, yet he now plans to usurp the throne. Let all under heaven disavow this betrayal. Another counselor tried to argue that Cao was the legitimate ruler. He not only has the emperor with him as a hostage, but with him, and he is ruling effectively, and he is also descended from a line of prime ministers. So, you want to talk qualifications, you want to talk about effectiveness, the 3 a.m. phone call. Who do you want to have in charge? Okay, here's Cao Cao. And Liang said, you know, if that is true, that this guy is not only effective, but also a descendant of all these prime ministers who served the Han, then he is twice a traitor. He is a traitor now because he has turned against his emperor, to whom he has sworn allegiance, and he is a traitor to his parents and ancestors because he is betraying their loyalty to the Han dynasty. So, the Battle of Chibi has another lesson, one that I've alluded to. It's not the strongest or the largest army that wins, but the better prepared. And to whom does the credit for preparation go? It is to Zhou Yu, the worthy antagonist of Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang and Zhou Yu form an unlikely partnership. They together schemed and plotted how best to stop the Shermanesque Cao Cao. Here he is, he's got cannons to the left, cannons to the right, he's got more ships than we have put together, he's got more troops than there are ants in our compound. What do we do? There was a huge sea battle. This battle was fought, and it was documented by a movie version called the Battle of Chibi, or the Battle of Red Cliffs, which is what Chibi means, and I have refused to translate it as such, because if I were to tell you it's the Battle of Red Cliffs, I would have to explain what Red Cliffs meant. Why not just tell you it's the Battle of Chibi, which sort of means the Battle of Red Cliffs, which is what the battle was, at which the Chinese equivalent of Sherman was defeated at the Chinese equivalent of the Battle of Atlanta. It does not talk about the land battles very much. The sea battles capture all the bandwidth of the movie, so to speak. And it's a fine movie. It's a great movie to be watching. It's about 5 hours long in the international version. I think the US version is about 3.5 hours long. There are many inaccuracies about it, but that's okay. There are many inaccuracies in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and it is a good story, well told, and battle scenes are actually best seen on the big screen. But there were plans for the land battles, and we know about them. And while Zhou Yu directs the land forces of the Wu, and he also directs the fleet, Zhuge Liang is busy sending various parties off here and there. He sends Zhang Fei with 3,000 to ambush, prepare an ambush along a certain road. He sends Zhao Zilong, another hero, into the forest with another 3,000 men. There are 3 detachments who were sent to patrol the river and take prisoners of Zhao's men. Lord Bei himself, 10 minutes? Or
20.
20 minutes. Oh, okay. Well, you can turn it off and I'll just wrap this up. Lord Bei himself was given the task of defending the city. Guan Yu was left without a task. And with this, I'm going to stop. Not going to read the oration. You can read it yourself. It's in the last chapter. I have followed my brothers through many battles. Today we face our greatest enemy, and yet you have assigned me no task. What is the meaning of this? Liang says, there is a very critical task, but I have misgivings over assigning it to you. What are you talking about? Some time ago, while we were on the run, and this battle takes place about 25 years after they were all young and in the militia, going after the outlaws with the yellow pieces of cloth. Sometime in the intervening 25 years, Cao Cao treated you with great kindness. And I believe you are deeply obligated to him. You have this sense of honor that won't quit. I cannot risk you're letting him escape. Guan Yu, who did have a reputation, and in fact his reputation for a sense of honor exceeded that of Liu Bei, who was his leader. He said that has long been repaid, and we are now on opposite sides. Why would I treat this task lightly? What if you do? Let me be punished by military discipline, execution. Put that in writing. And so he did. And Guan says, well, what if Cao Cao doesn't pass where you say he will pass? And so Liu says, if you like, I'll put that in writing. And so he did. And after this little humorous exchange, Guan leaves, and Bei comes by and says, you know, my younger brother, calls both Zhang Fei and Guan Yu his younger brother, is the very model of honor. I too fear he will let Cao escape. Liang said, I have consulted the astrological charts, and there is no indication that fate has decreed that Cao Cao will either be captured or killed during this encounter, during these battles. And so, to allow Guan Yu the opportunity to earn merit with mercy, it's also a good thing. With that, I'm going to end, because we're at 20-minute mark. I promised this would not take 20 minutes. I skip over a 2-page funeral eulogy on page 308, 309. By the way, the book has a glossary. This is my concession to the problems of Chinese names. And to qualify to be included in the glossary, the character had to be named at least twice, more than twice in the text. And with Word, you know, it's so easy to find things and then stick them in the glossary and so on and so forth. The glossary is still 11 pages long. Okay, so I still get a lot of complaints. God, and all these names. I'm going to try and go back and make this cleaner, and eventually, when I get around to it, there will be a more streamlined version that hopefully will have only a 3-page glossary as opposed to an 11-page glossary. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, Mark?
Sure, I get lost in I'm totally ignorant of all this stuff, this history, so I get lost in it. But the framework of when things happen, like I think I produced when you said 1500, it was 1200 years old, so it sounds like Battle of Chibi, is that what it was? It was about
Chibi was about 2208.
Oh, okay, so it was, okay, so I was thinking it was about 300, but it was about
we're
300.
able to
So
paint it with relatively...
and is that the one that split China along the Yangtze River?
It splits China so that there was not an empire again for about 400 years.
And I'm just curious, did Mandarin and Cantonese develop as a result of that Yangtze River divide? Or were they already in existence at that time?
It very likely had something to do with the Yangtze divide, but you know, in Canton, there was established this, how do you write the Chinese classics statutes?
But the language,
so they knew how to write it, but they didn't necessarily pronounce it the same way.
Right, because you can
exactly.
Speakers of either language can understand the writing of the problem. It's the same, right?
And this is the beauty of the Chinese written form.
Right.
They are those characters are called Han characters.
Oh, really? After the dynasty?
After the dynasty, in which they were codified and said, "This is how we are going to write it, guys, and you will obey." And so that's how that became in Japanese kanji.
Oh, wow.
They were Hanzi in Chinese. I don't know what the Koreans call it, because the Koreans also started out with the Han characters, and then about 1,000 years or so later, they said this is very illogical. The Koreans are very logical people. They said, why don't we do this and this and this, and we could make the language better, the written language. And so they sent a delegation to the imperial court in China, because the Chinese influence was recognized, if not Chinese authority. And the emperor said, "Oh my God, I wish you would. I've been trying to get our guys to do something, but they're always arguing with each other." So with the emperor's blessing on the QT, the Korean script was developed, which, according to the people who know, is a more logical way to write things. So, but there's another story about the Cantonese and the Mandarin divide. Canton and the next province, or the whole areas contiguous with Canton, the people there colloquially do not refer to themselves as Han people. They recognize when the census takers come around, they say, yeah, we're Han people. Okay? But when they talk among themselves, they call themselves people of Tang, which is the next dynasty, which is like 750, not 200 BC to 200 AD. In fact, Chinatown is called the road of the Tang people. The Chinatowns in the United States, because they are predominantly Cantonese.
Where were the Tang from?
And the Tang ruled from about 650 to 950.
But I mean, what part of China were they from?
They finally pacified the South. The Han pacification of the South only got to Canton and the city, but didn't reach throughout the countryside.
So the Tang were northerners then? Were they?
The Tang were also northerners. In fact, there are some people who think that the Tang were not Chinese, that they belong to some tribe.
Was that the Manchurian one?
No, that's the Qing. But they belong to some other tribe that were Sinified, because China was Big Brother. That's where the malls were, and so you go there. Your women go there. Your kids go there to shop. So, hey.
So, but if Tang was in the north, isn't that Mandarin?
Right, they spoke Mandarin also.
And yet, if we have the Tang peoples making up most of the Chinatowns in the States, and they speak Cantonese, I'm confused.
They mostly spoke Cantonese. They were, in fact, it's amazing. The Chinese, until recently, the Chinese in New York were mostly from 2 or 3 villages that were very close to each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But they colloquially refer to themselves as people of Tang.
Even though they're Cantonese, right?
They were Cantonese,
Yeah,
so especially because they were
Speaking
Cantonese.
Cantonese. Huh.
But in written form, they would use Mandarin. Because written Chinese can be pronounced by Cantonese or Mandarin. Another interesting aside is that during the Republican era, after the Qing emperor went bye-bye, and there were warlords and so on and so forth, there was some concern about, what should we do with the Chinese language? And one of the proposals was to make Cantonese the language. It lost because, Beijing had always been the capital. But at least Beijing became the capital. It was actually the Mongols that made Beijing the capital.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, around 1200 AD. And then it stayed the capital for the next 800 years. So, but Beijing was just another small white spot in the road in North China. Compared to the other two capitals.
So what do the Mongols speak then? I'm curious.
The Mongols, for a while, under Genghis Khan, the Mongols maintained Mongol language. In the travels of Marco Polo, there is a description, difficult to authenticate because neither palace exists, of both a regular brick and mortar palace and a palace that was constructed out of canes, bamboo, that could be erected. I mean, this was not just a tent, this was a big tent. Because the Mongols liked the idea that they could strike camp and head out to the hills. And
sounds like their way of life anyway. What are those huts called?
yurts.
Yeah.
And under the Mongols, the Chinese were kind of low on in terms of the pecking order. But that changed after Genghis Khan died, and Kublai Khan, his grandnephew or something like that, adopted more Chinese ways, allowed Chinese. They were the bureaucrats. So you'd have a couple of Mongols, to be looking over these guys, but you need bureaucrats. I mean, it's what we wish we could have in Afghanistan. We wish we could rely on a bunch of Afghanistan bureaucrats to run Afghanistan with just a few Marines looking over their shoulders. We don't have that.
Right.
We have to do their jobs for them.
Yeah.
But the Mongols did have that in China. So they had the special ops people just look.
It's interesting because Russia's had power over Mongolia for such a long time, and I've heard that China considers Mongolia part of China. So if Russia didn't have the power over, political power over Mongolia, do you think Mongolia might be a part of China today, as Tibet is?
Well, that's why Mongolia is divided. There is Outer Mongolia, or the Mongol Republic, which used to be part of the Union of Soviet Republics. And there's Inner Mongolia, which is a part of China.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
So the part that we see as a part of Russia is Outer Mongolia, I take it then.
Right.
Okay.
And then there's a part that is, it's
Wow.
part of China, but they're considered a minority.
Nowadays.
About 10% of the Chinese population is made up of minorities. But if you have 1.3 billion people, 10% is a lot of people.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it sounds like it sounds pretty obvious that they're related much more closely linguistically, at least. So, at the very least, so it sounds like they're much more.
Mongols,
Yeah.
I don't know about the Mongol language. I know that Manchurian it's a separate language, and I knew people who were in graduate school when I was studying history, or who were in the East Asian literature and languages program, and they were studying Manchurian. So Manchurian is a developed language. I don't know about Mongolia. Probably was.
Especially if you go back in time before the Russian influence, whatever.
But you need to have records of it.
Linguistics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Written text. And I am told, I don't know for a fact, that there are two alphabets used by the Mongol speakers. One which is the Mongol, developed in the part where, one which adopted the Tibetan form of writing. Not an expert on this sort of stuff. But it is interesting.
Yeah, well, the book's intriguing, hearing all that stuff. It's just, naturally you want to question it.
Yeah.
You were saying that this book somewhat stemmed from kind of the original gathering of all this information in 1500,
Yes.
which was 1200 years after the fact, so to speak,
Right.
in round terms,
Right.
speaking of Chinese round terms.
Yes.
And how were these facts gathered? And I understand why a narrator would reorganize things to make more of an impact in a dialogue form, but how were they kept? How were they archived? What were they written on? Did scholars just simply put a scroll here, and their assistants went like this, after lunch or something? Like, how? I've always curious about
fair question. I don't know all the details, but sometime in the 4th century, 300 and so forth, the history of the three kingdoms was written down. Okay, so the bare bones, so and so marched thus and so and did so and so. And about a generation or so after he did that, there was another guy who wrote a commentary on this. And usually the two are published together as the annals of the three kingdoms. Then there were various poems and stories, and many of these were lost, but many of them survived as actors' prompt books. Storytellers apparently had flip charts. Poems were written, and many of the poems were written by established poets who incorporated them into their scrolls and so forth. And in the 13 and 1400s, some group of guys, don't know who, collected all this material. They went through all this stuff. They started with the basic kernel, which is the annals. And then the annals were pretty good about the official edicts and proclamations, the messages that were said to have been sent by one person to another. But the commentary on the action came from the actors' prompt books or the storytellers' flip charts, all the poems that were discovered and then copied from these scrolls by these guys who were interested. And there was some interest in this kind of popular culture.
Were there any paintings?
No. Painting as a form of Chinese culture, I shouldn't say no bluntly, but not well-known ones. Painting as a developed form became part of the Chinese cultural scene around 1000 AD. Before that, we may have had scribblings and so on and so forth, but not much to speak of. Yes, sir.
I'm kind of curious because I'm wondering about the annals. Was it kind of put together kind of like how the Bible was, where it was all everybody's different stories, and they tried to stick them together and see what was coherent? Yeah, was it something like? Is it a bunch of coherent stories, or is it just one story that somehow they put together?
It is a pretty coherent story. I've not read it myself, but I'm told that it is, I mean, people continually go back to it and say, see here, there's a difference between the annals and the romance.
So
Okay.
was it written by several authors then?
The annals were written by actually two guys. One guy who wrote it originally,
Right.
and it was well regarded. You know, it was compared to the other annals of the then Han Dynasty and so on and so forth. And then this guy wrote a commentary, but he did such a good job of finding documents which this previous guy had not seen fit to include.
Right.
So he sort of backfilled
Right.
the annals,
Made a lot more
as
understandable.
opposed to giving different views
Right.
of the same
Right,
event. He backfilled it with more detail, more,
So basically we're
more
trusting-
correspondence, more documentation.
So basically, we're trusting the first guy's view, and the
Right.
second guy just made it clear.
Right.
And so we're trusting the first guy's view, and so
Right.
I guess then I'd be wondering how accurate was the first guy, but you know, we have no way
I
to
mean, at
determine
some
that.
point, you know, we have to say, you know, what's the record? And
Right.
there isn't much more.
And if the second guy was filling in with the documentation and whatnot, it'd probably be reasonable to assume that the original guy wasn't just making it up, that he was researching quite a bit
Right.
and pulling things together, oral tradition and whatnot, and basing his original on that.
But then again, he's only human, so I'm wondering,
He
you know.
is.
You know, I'm
And
going to give you the
despite-
Manchurian version or whatever it is, you know.
And despite the effort of the second guy,
Uh-huh.
he does have a name, Shen Chou.
Exactly.
And despite the efforts of this guy, this was 4th century. Somewhere around the 11th century, there was a guy who was who went and researched, and he compiled a history of 14 centuries of Chinese history. And he found some documents which these two guys did not include. And he included them in his, what he called the comprehensive mirror for